This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Miriam Libicki. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Andy and I are going to be talking with Miriam Libicki. Her recent book, Toward a Hot Jew, came out late last year from Fantagraphics. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and since in this episode we're talking to Miriam Libicki, you can actually find her new book, Toward a Hot Jew, graphic novel, on DCB service for 30% off, so that's a good deal. So you can check that. If you listen to this interview and you like what you hear, check that book out at our sponsor.
That's right. So you can get a great deal on Toward a Hot Jew and many, many other comics at Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, this was a fun interview. I had known about Miriam's work through Jobnik, and I didn't know of any of her essays, with maybe one or two exceptions. So when last year they announced that this collection of graphic essays was going to be coming out in later fall, I was really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. And I think we had mentioned it on our particular previews episode when it showed up in that book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go ahead and let our listeners listen to that conversation.
Yep. Okay, we're glad to have on this episode Miriam Libicki to talk about her new book, Toward a Hot Jew. So, Miriam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the show.
And so, first of all, would you describe Toward a Hot Jew as like a collection of essays in comics form?
Yeah, I call them drawn essays, although I'm not insistent on that term. It's just what I happen to call them. I guess inspired by Donna Barr calling her graphic novels drawn books. Because I feel like, the act of drawing is pretty important, especially in my methods, at least for these essays. Like some of them are very wordy, and I hand letter all the words too. And so that's kind of important to me, like that the lettering is also drawn. It seems like part of the an important part of the project. So yeah, I mean, I would say that they're in comics form, although drawn essays, maybe helps give the impression that that it's not necessarily structured like a comic. Like there are sometimes panels and there are sometimes speech balloons. But just as often, you'll have like a full page image that's just kind of surrounded by text. Or sometimes you'll have almost all text and just a few little images thrown in.
Well, since we're on the topic of terminology, actually, one of the things I wanted to start with, because I found this really interesting, in your essay, Jewish memoir goes pow zap oi, which I think originally appeared in the Jewish graphic novel anthology, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You use the phrase to describe that and some of the work you do, gonzo literary comics.
Right.
And I really like that term. So could you maybe describe for the listeners what you mean by gonzo literary comics?
Well, I was kind of talking about the genre of autobiographical comics, but a lot of them are not, like, many autobiographical comics are somewhat fictionalized. And I was also talking about what I saw as the influences and origins of autobiographical comics. And it seemed to me that Philip Roth's sort of semi-confessional style, like confessional without being autobiographical, especially his early stuff, especially Portnoy's Complaint, was a big influence on both Crumb and Picard, and maybe others. So I kind of... so I thought of gonzo as something that is not necessarily true and not necessarily autobio, but in some way implicates the author and puts the author at risk in the act of making the thing. I guess, Hunter S. Thompson and Philip Roth were kind of, of the same era of putting the self more in things that were supposed to be more sort of lofty and bringing them down.
Right, yeah, and Roth got a lot of hell for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought...
Irving Howe accused him of not so much being a novelist, but as being a sit-down comedian.
Right. Yeah, I feel like, Portnoy's Complaint, of course, hardly any of the facts in it, are drawn from his life, but it's in the style of confession. The whole thing is a monologue. It's an introductory session with a psychologist is the conceit of that book. So I felt that tone there, you just kind of spill your guts and especially say all the most painful and also painful and also, bad things about yourself as part of the story is something that is still a big part of the genre of autobio in comics.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, I've been thinking about autobiographical comics a lot since I've been writing about it lately, and Derek's done work in it too. And, that is one of the things that kind of on an academic side that academics wrestle with autobiographical comics in relationship to the larger genre of autobiography. So what really struck me in reading this essay was how that really helps. Gonzo literary comics really helps in distinguishing what an autobiographer would do in comics versus what one does, in say a prose autobiography, but also what the role of the reader is then in relationship to that, which you do touch on too, which I thought was really interesting. That in a prose autobiography, we kind of are looking at that as almost kind of like juridical evidence. Mm-hmm. And we can't do that with comics autobiography, right?
Right. You can't pretend that it's not a mediated experience.
Yeah.
Right. This issue of autobiography, journalism, and the use of Philip Roth, I can't help but think of Anya Ulinik's Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel, because there's Miriam. Have you read that?
I did. Yeah, okay. I read it just once, but I read it last year, and I really liked it.
Yeah, because there's that scene, an important scene, where Lena is on a bus and next to someone, and she falls asleep and dreams that this is Philip Roth, and so Philip Roth talks to her, and it's at that moment that things in her story take an interesting turn. But I mention that not only because of the comics and the Philip Roth there, but also that's something that is written in many ways like an autobiography, but it is not. And It's one of those texts that it's easy to forget as you're reading it that this is not Ulianik's autobiography here, this is a work of fiction.
Right. Yeah, she really plays with how much you can map onto her life and how much you can't, especially with the male romantic lead being a very mysterious figure.
Yeah.
Who may or may not be real, kind of both in the book and in real life.
Yeah. So do you see this concept applying to the other stuff you do? I mean, would you include the essays and the more journalistic pieces you do under this category, or are you kind of separating those into something else?
Well, I think to an extent, and I think I kind of always there's a lot of me, and I never try to obscure that there's a lot of me, even when it's a very heavily research-based piece. And you wouldn't think that I would be the subject. But in humanities, I just really like the post-colonial idea that, that there isn't, that the objective voice speaking from authority is kind of a fiction that needs to be dismantled. And so even when I'm doing a piece that's, very heavily researched and I'm not, lying about anything, I always want to put in front of the reader that where I'm coming from when I'm saying these things to you.
That's really interesting, because I really found those postmodern ideas that you get into, especially in the last piece, your discussion of them really does lend itself to doing this in comics form or in a drawn form. That there is something about the medium that you're choosing to do these things in that that makes some of those complex ideas easier to grasp in some way, because probably, I'm not sure, because maybe the medium already foregrounds some of those issues.
Yeah, I feel like partly it makes it easier for me to understand. I'm very interested in philosophy and cultural theory and stuff, but I find it very hard to think abstractly. So I'll almost always need to visualize something in some sort of specific way in order to understand it. Like when, you talk about polarization, then I had to envision an actual magnet to understand, what binaries are and what polarization is. So yeah, that's definitely one thing that I find appealing in comics, is that I feel like I need visual things to understand these abstract concepts, and then if I can put these visual things back in, then maybe it's easier for other people to follow, and maybe it's also more, less boring.
And that last essay that you were referring to, and this is Stranging the Welcomer.
Right.
This one strikes me as a standout from everything else in the collection, not only because it's I think the longest one in the book, but it's also much more expository than journalistic, whereas the other pieces, I read them in I guess mostly as examples of reportage. And in Stranging the Welcomer, you definitely have a particular critical position in a point or a series of points that you're arguing. And so it stands out in that way. But it also stands out, and I'm curious about this, in its visuals, because this piece is very different from the rest, not only in terms of the style of your art, but specifically the colors that you chose to use. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the decisions you made in how you drew Stranging the Welcomer.
This took me a long, long time to write this essay, but I was always kind of dreaming of it as something that I could get academically published. Something that I could get academically published, but it could still read to a layperson. and, also be a comic. So it went through several sort of stages of what the focus would be and how long it would be. And it ended up being 44 pages because I kind of, just doing a cursory look, that seemed to be the longest thing that I could get published in an academic journal. And so the look of it was kind of drawn out of that I thought, if it's going to be published in a journal or possibly an anthology in academia, I would have to allow for the fact that it could be printed in black and white. But since I also had in my mind that I wanted to publish my drawn essays as a book once I had enough of them to be book-sized, and some of my drawn essays are watercolor, the book would be in color, so it would be best if the longest essay in the book was also in color. So I needed to have something that would be in color, but could also reproduce fine in black and white. And as well, because it was such a behemoth, I wanted to simplify my process of art as much as I could. So doing full watercolors would have, delayed that essay by at least another year, probably. So what I used is orange lacquer ink. And I decided that I needed to use some kind of monochrome. And I was thinking at first of like brown or sepia, but since it's an essay about race, like that seemed a little on the nose. I said I wanted something that could be like warm tones, but not anything that was too specifically evocative of like skin. And I didn't want to do red because, it might be too evocative of blood. So, and I just like the color orange. So I thought that it was sort of, warm without running the risk of being naturalistic. And I found this ink that I really liked. And it was a bit of a cheat even, because I found this particular lacquer ink that when it was diluted in a wash with water, it was quite yellowy. And when it was concentrated the most, it was a real red orange. So it was kind of a way of that I could actually sneak more than one color, but I was still just using one jar of ink.
Huh. That is interesting.
It's basically an ink wash, but it's an orange ink wash.
One of the things I'm getting from this that's really interesting is how you kind of problem solve certain things that are unique to doing these essays in comics form. So that there's this practical consideration you're talking about with the ink and color, and that just reminded me. And I'm kind of a citation nerd. Like I memorize citation formats and enjoy it, which is weird. But how like in your and part of it is because my wife writes English composition handbooks, so we're doing we're covering.
So
all
you're
of them.
always up on the latest trends in English composition.
Yeah, in citation formats.
Yeah, but, my co-host is hip and now when it comes to citation formats.
So when I was thinking about this, like some of the problems that arise from doing an essay in comics form that need to be solved, like in your essay Strangers, where you color code the text to indicate different sources, and then provide a guide for that at the beginning. And you also use different. I mean, this is all hand drawn, but you draw or handwritten in the lettering, but you use different kind of font styles then too, to indicate differences. So, how did you arrive at those kind of solutions for problems like that?
I think that in my first drawn essay, well, I guess Art Adventures was maybe the first, depending on how you count, but I ended up redoing that. So in my first drawn essay that was really a drawn essay, which is Towards a Hot Jew, the title essay, I think I started a thing of doing quotes in a sans serif style. I don't remember exactly. I have a memory that I did that. That most of it is written. No, I guess it was and now that I have my book in front of me, so I can look. In Jewish Memoir Goes Pawzat Boy, the first one we were talking about, the Rothi one. When I have a quote from somebody and I have it as a speech balloon coming out of their mouth, then it's drawn in a different font. It's drawn in a sans serif font, whereas the text that is not inside speech balloons is drawn in a courier type font. So partly that was for the look, I think. That, we're more used to seeing sans serif inside a speech balloon. But partly it was also that I felt like it was a way of bringing in a different voice. Like there is that the courier stuff that's the text of the essay has a very specific voice, and it's not necessarily an authoritative voice because it's still kind of my somewhat irreverent voice. But if I'm quoting somebody else, I kind of wanted it to be in their voice and not mine. And so that was how the sans serif for a certain text started. And generally, I do really like to show my work. I liked for people to be able to, look at what I looked at and prove or disprove what I'm saying. I guess I never really, I only studied humanities as part of being an art student, but there are just a lot of things about humanities that I really like, and part of it, and other social sciences, is that you should always be able to evaluate an argument by going back to sources. But at the same time, I need people to be able to read straight through it as a comic. So I have footnotes in my, for instance, in Stranging the Welcomer, I have footnotes. But they will be right there in the panel, and they'll be as short and as possible. So they are not proper citations, but they're at least something that you can have. So I do always want to have a way to show my work, and also have a way to sort of show that I'm incorporating different voices. But to do it in a way where you can also read straight through. You don't have to either be interrupting your reading or refer to something after where you have to remember all your reading.
Now, you had mentioned a moment ago that this collection that eventually became Toward a Hot Jew is something that you had been planning on doing for a while. So you had decided fairly early on in doing these individual essays or journalistic pieces that eventually you would collect them into book form.
Right. So I have an ongoing series, although it's been on hiatus for a couple of years, unfortunately, which is Jobnik, which is more of a narrative comic, autobio comic. And so Jobnik was my project that kind of got me into comics. I didn't make any comics before I started making Jobnik. And I was just trying to put them out. And since it's this long serialized story, then the style has to remain more or less consistent throughout Jobnik. And it's changed. And I actually did go back and redraw a bunch of my earlier issues. But anyways, the drawn essays were a way where, if I had a thought about something, or if I wanted to experiment with another kind of medium in art, I could combine the two, and I could just write a short little essay about something I thought and something I wanted to harangue people about. And I have been self-published most of my career, and I get most of my readers through Comic Cons. I don't have that good of an online presence. I am always, I don't know. I'm not always working on that, but I'm always wishing I was better at that. But I go to a lot of cons, and I always did. And going to conventions was a good way to have deadlines. And it was also it did kind of reward, not financially, but I guess in other ways, doing small short zines, that if I could come out with, 2 or 3 small short zines in a year, people would always have a new thing to stop by my table for. And now I don't do 2 or 3 short zines in a year because I have 2 kids. But if I can even do 1 zine a year, it's much easier than having a full graphic novel. I mean, it's easier for me to work that way, but it's also easier because people say, "Oh, I saw you last year. What's new?" And if I'm working on a graphic epic, it might be 10 years before anything is new. So the drawn essays were always just a way to do things that were more experimental, both with writing style and with art. That would be a side project to me doing this long serialized autobiography. But since they were little zines, I would sell like 100 or 200 of them and be done. So it was always in my mind that when I got enough, if I got over 120 pages of them, that I would pitch that to publishers.
Okay, so it's like so pieces like Strangers, Who Wants to Be an Art Star, and Fierce, Ease, and then the story Toward a Hot Jew. I mean, these are things that you would have at cons as individual self-published comics that people could pick up, and they can still get, by the way, or at least some of them at your website, realgonegirl.com. Let's definitely get that out there. But then you had plans all along to combine these into book form.
Right.
So what brought you to Gary Groth and Fantagraphics?
Well, I always admired them. Like, they published a lot of stuff that I liked, such as R. Crumb, who, like Philip Roth, is definitely a problematic fave. But they had a big presence at cons all the time. They're from Seattle. I'm from Vancouver. So it seemed like I would run into them at cons a lot. I submitted some of my first Jobnik stories to them, just in the mail. And for that, I got somebody that I have actually never talked to at Fantagraphics again. And it got a kind of weird letter, although, at least it wasn't a form letter. But just socially, I got to know Gary Groth and I got to know Eric Reynolds through doing cons and liked them a lot. And they would kind of say to me that that they were more interested in the drawn essays than in Jobnik, and that, when I got enough of them for a book, let them know, and no guarantees, but let them know. So basically, they would come and buy the zines whenever I would have a new zine out. They would pay me $5 or whatever. So it was definitely, that was one of my goals in over the years, accumulating these zines, is that they were somebody that I could send it to.
Now, you mentioned here too, Jobnik, which is about your experience in the Israeli army, right?
Right.
And so that experience also shows up here as well. So in Toward a Hot Jew. So could you maybe talk a little bit about that experience and how that that has become a subject that you've dealt with in comics?
Yeah, so I finished high school a year early. Both of my older siblings had finished high school a year early and then went to yeshiva, to religious seminary in Israel. And I was very into the finish high school a year early part, but I was not so into the religious seminary part. So I found this program in Israel that was all kids who were about to enlist in the army but took a gap year from the army and lived in a neighborhood in Jerusalem and did kind of informal learning and community service in the neighborhood. So it just kind of sounded cool. I guess a friend of a friend had thought about doing it, but she didn't do it in the end. And so I went there, and that was just a huge formative year for me. And I was the only American. And so it was very difficult, but it was very rewarding. And just out of that year, I was really inspired, and I wanted to be a real Israeli like my friends, and I wanted to give back to the country. So it took me a year all told to both get my citizenship and enlist in the Army. So I was 19, I think, by the time I joined. Just because it was a lot of bureaucratic things to go through. And so the next 2 years, year and 9 months, I was in the Army, and I was kind of hoping to go on to university in Israel, but I applied to I guess there are more schools with art programs, but there's kind of one school that is the art school in Israel, which is Bezalel. And I applied to that and I didn't get in. And so I ended up coming back to the States, and then moving to Canada right after that. So Jobnik began as a short comic that I did once I started art school in Canada. And it was kind of my way to process and talk about the 4 years of my life when I'd been in Israel. And it got a really good response just from my classmates. And so it was when I was still in school that I decided I'm going to tell the whole story of my Army service in comics form. So the story comprises a year and 9 months. In the comics that have come out, a year has gone by, and I've been doing them for 11, 12 years. So it's going quite slowly, but that was kind of the project that made me decide to be a cartoonist, basically. I'd always been interested in comics, but I didn't think that I had the discipline or a subject. And so then that was the subject, and it kind of gave me the discipline to learn to cartoon so that I could do the story properly.
Now, those first 6 issues of Jobnik, that's what is collected in the book Jobnik, An American Girl's Adventures in the Israeli Army, correct?
Right. I have put out 10 issues so far. Okay. Many of the second 4, a lot of them are out of print at this point. And I have, I just have to make 2 more and then have another volume. But everything keeps getting in the way of me doing the next issues.
So you do plan on publishing eventually a second volume of Jobnik? Yes.
It should be a 3rd volume also. I have a kind of a sketchy outline that goes till 18 issues. So they are still in the works.
That's interesting because it struck me in going back and rereading Jobnik before this interview, I couldn't help but think that someone coming to this thinking that this first volume of Jobnik is all there is in terms of Jobnik could read it and feel that there was a satisfying ending. In other words, they could get to the very last page, how you leave off, and think, okay, there you go. And not necessarily wonder where the next installment or when the next installment is coming.
Yeah, I kind of wanted each issue to have sort of an ending. I'm not into cliffhangers or decompressed storytelling or anything like that. And I did want the book to be able to read as a book because I feel as a person who even likes serialized comics and even, I like some manga series and stuff that are huge and long. I prefer it when books have endings to when books don't have endings.
Now, one of the things I noticed also about Jobnik is that, it is more straight autobiography than anything we get in Toward a Hot Jew. However, there are those journalistic elements in Jobnik because whenever there's conflict, it seems that the autobiographical subject, Miriam, is listening to the radio or watching television, and you're meticulous about representing the actual news that's going on. And even if the main character or others around her don't comment on the news that they're hearing, it nonetheless becomes important. So it's almost as if this is kind of a backdoor form of reportage. Did you see it that way?
Yeah, for sure. Even in the stuff that's more straightforward storytelling, I'm definitely still interested in the differences between, personal reality and greater consensus reality. and I still approach it like the way I write Jobnik is still really as a research project. That I'll start an issue of Jobnik by, nailing down the dates that the story takes place in, and then looking through newspaper archives of what happened during those dates. And then my own army journals are just another source. So, I research what was happening in Israel, and then I research, what was this person doing who happens to be me.
Now, you've mentioned, Hunter S. Thompson, and you've also referenced Joe Sacco before in terms of, influences when it comes to your work as a journalist. What other kind of journalist have you turned to, not necessarily for influence, but just for appreciation, both in and out of comics?
Well, I like a lot of journalism. I don't know that I have read a lot of... I don't know if I've read a lot of nonfiction books written by journalists. Maybe I have, and I'm just not remembering them. But I definitely like literary journalism as a genre. I'm doing my master's in creative writing right now, and my thesis advisor, one of them, is Deborah Campbell, who is a literary journalist. So I really like her stuff. She does a lot of stuff about the Middle East, and her stuff is, it's very deeply researched and rooted in history, but she also always travels and does really sensitive, portraits of people in her journalism, and as well has a kind of sarcastic voice as a person. So I would say that her stuff has been an influence on me. I mean, I think I was tending towards some of those things already, but just seeing them in the genre of journalism has been helpful.
Now, you mentioned you're getting your master's in creative writing, and that sounds really interesting. So are you able to do comics as part of that program?
Yes, that was kind of part of the conditions of me doing the master's. I wanted to go back to school. Partially, I just missed being a student. And partially, I had gotten to teach a couple of comics classes in continuing ed. And I just figured that if I wanted to teach more, then a master's was a good thing to get. So if I wanted to teach comics, I sort of had the option of either going for a MFA in art or going for an MFA in writing. And when I interviewed people from art programs, they basically said, oh no, graphic novels are not considered art. And when I interviewed people in creative writing departments, they were like, graphic novels are an exciting new form of writing. So I was like, writing it is. Plus, as well, I got my BFA, my undergrad degree was all in art in an art school. So I thought it might be nice to try to work harder on my other muscles.
Mm-hmm. That also then brings up that the first essay, first piece in this, in Toward a Hot Jew, who wants to be an art star, which talks about your experience as an undergrad. Are you? I mean, it sounds like when you were looking for a program to get into, there's still a resistance to doing comics. Was that resistance, do you feel, similar to what you faced when you were doing your BFA?
I think it was much more 15 years ago than it is now. I am teaching at my alma mater, and I am teaching comics in the illustration department. When I was going there was no illustration department. So I feel like art schools, if not the art world, I think the art world still doesn't consider comics art. And the literature world pretty much considers comics literature. So the art world is like, well, literature can have them then. But in art schools, there are a lot of students who are interested in making comics. And so art schools have kind of, started to be a bit more open to it, I feel.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that art programs are less inclined to, I guess, embrace comics. Because I mean, I've always thought it was good that English programs, literary programs, are have grown fond of comics now. But I've always wondered if there's a danger of comics, an overemphasis of comics as literature that will make it or attempt to make it into something that it's not. And that's something that it's not is basically losing a lot of the art side of the equation.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I feel like whenever you read any serious analysis of comics, it's almost always just the text. That's, it's been a criticism of a lot of the scholarship of Alison Bechdel because, superficially you could take the pictures out of Alison Bechdel, out of Fun Home and still be able to read it. Mm-hmm. So, people who go and analyze it then were like, well, okay, let's go ahead and pretend there are no pictures here. So that's the most egregious example, but I feel like, if you read a lot of comics criticism from literature people, you will get this idea that, the drawings are a novelty or not there.
Yeah. Well, the example of Bechdel and, especially with Fun Home, I mean, that's just a text that begs to be used in a literature class with a capital L because of the abundant number of literary references that she makes in that narrative. And then on top of that, that is a very text-heavy comic. And so, again, it kind of lends itself on multiple levels to this kind of acceptance in ways that I think that other comic creators who are just as, at least, ambitious with their stories, with less of a reliance on text, may not be accepted in the same way.
Right. Yeah, I would say, also with Chris Ware, he might not have as much text, but he has those nice small panels that look more like words or sentences.
Yeah, exactly. We have to get close to the page in order to really understand and see it clearly, kind of like reading small words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I think that's something that a lot of comic scholars, especially with literature backgrounds, do kind of struggle with and are conscientious of that. And I know that that's true for me too, that I tend to catch myself talking too much about the writer because I have the background and the tools and the language to do that. And not feeling in the right comfort zone for talking about the art.
Right. But I mean, I feel like that's a problem in visual art too. I mean, we're just a logocentric society. So that's why, I cynically felt in art school that the artist statement ends up being more important than the painting.
Yeah, but in many ways it kind of goes beyond when it comes to comics appreciation. Beyond the bifurcation of text and the visuals, or let's say literature and art. I've written a couple of times in reviews that whenever there is a critical work on comics that is written by an academic who is not from an English department, I'm always excited because it brings a very different perspective. So, something from someone in political science or communication studies will bring a whole new set of lenses and I guess a perspective in a language that we're not used to. Those of us who are in literary studies, like Andy, I have the same, that kind of training, and I tend to look at comics primarily through a literary lens, focusing primarily on the narrative and not on a lot of the other things that go around it. So it always opens my eyes, and I think those are the kind of scholars as well, those academics who seem to be more amenable to some of the more popular stuff that at times get short shrifted in the literary scholarship.
Yeah, totally. I guess maybe the literary people though feel more loyalty to comics. So they have to. They're still afraid that they might hurt comics or hurt their own reputation if they're looking at soap operas. Whereas people from other disciplines don't have that sensitivity.
Right. Except those with a background in popular culture studies.
Do people with a background in popular culture studies worry about being respectable?
No. I mean, they're more accepting of the more popular soap opera-y stuff like the superheroes and whatnot.
Mm.
Right.
That's interesting to me. Is one of the things you're describing too is the phenomenon that I've seen a lot. Well, that was my story too. Is the academics who got into comic studies after they'd received tenure for doing traditional literary scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you get tenure and then I don't have to worry about anybody judging this. I'm just going to do comics from now on.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the route I think both of us have taken. But now people are writing their dissertations on just solely comic studies, which and snapping up all those comic studies jobs that are floating around in every university. Things have changed.
Yeah, the people at UBC, so where I'm doing my master's at the University of British Columbia, and so creating comics has kind of become the creative writings department. Like, I don't think in the art department in the undergrad you get any sort of comics anything. But the study of comics is, it seems like the two people who are sort of in charge of courses that are a study of comics, one guy is, or they're both from like the classics department. One guy is a Jewish studies scholar and the other guy is a Greek scholar. But they just liked comics, so they started doing the comic stuff. So I do think that's, kind of cool that in academia that it kind of started as an ad hoc thing that people from whatever discipline who just happened to like comics became the comics people in their university, and then suddenly the students wanted to take these classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what's great about, we were talking before we started recording that you and I had met very, very briefly at CXC in Columbus, Ohio, that the academic component of that the academic conference was so multidisciplinary, and I really enjoy that. I really enjoy being able to make friends who aren't necessarily in English departments. And just it's just a broader and better experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Miriam, I wanted to go back to Toward a Hot Jew, because one of the things that comes across in most of the pieces in this collection is your own struggles with your experience and your identification with the nation of Israel, and at the same time very much aware and uncomfortable with some of the national policy, especially over the past 10 to 15 years. And I'm wondering if this is also not just a personal struggle, but something that you find, if not a point of tension, then a potential point of tension with your interactions with friends, both here and abroad. It seems like you hint that this may be the case at times in the essays, but for me, the takeaway was that this was more of an internal struggle.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I feel like my friends in Israel are mostly on the left, and I guess my friends in Israel that are on the right, I don't really talk politics with them because I feel a little bit like, except for my family, them I still talk politics with, but my friends, I do feel like, I still feel like a little bit of the, American Zionist thing where, who am I to talk about what life in Israel is like? And I mean, I guess there are, of course, now we all have Facebooky friends that would be fume at their posts and may not say anything. So that is pretty regular. I would say that I'm not really at odds with my family about this too much. I mean, my one family member that I am at odds with, then, we are less close than my other family members. So I think it is more of an internal struggle. I think it's more that, when I left, that I had this big Zionist dream to move to Israel, and not just that, but to help Israel, to contribute my life to making Israel better, in a very, young, idealistic sort of way. And even after the army, I still kind of had that notion. And so when I ended up going back for university, and then I ended up really putting down roots in Canada, I had a lot of guilt about it. And that was a big driver of, am I just a fake Israeli now? Did it mean something that I was in Israel? Was it just a foolish, childish notion? Can I still help the country? Do I still belong to the country? And I feel like as I've got more and more roots in Canada, and, a partner and children in Canada and all that, and as Israel has kind of moved farther away from my values, the government in Israel for sure, I am interested in the diaspora side of the Israel diaspora relationship, and the idea that, Jews outside of Israel are not less authentic, and are not, running away from something, but we have our own meaning and we have our own mission.
You mentioned Facebooky friends. I noticed a few times in these essays, social media came into play as a way for you to keep in touch with people, get the news, and to understand what was going on there. I mean, how much do you rely on social media, like Facebook or Twitter or whatever other platforms, to keep in touch with your friends over there?
It's my main way, and it's my main way of looking at news too, kind of. I mean, Haaretz website is so bad; it's so ad-filled, and I guess a lot of people, it's just kind of easier to read news on Facebook because you kind of get what Facebook thinks is important to you, and you don't get other stuff. Same with Twitter. So I would say that I do follow journalists, and I follow Israeli journalists. So it is, and that is the main way I keep in touch with my Israeli friends also, is on Facebook. And it is also a way that I can beat myself up and feel guilty, because as I've been away from Israel, I have lost a lot of, reading was never my strongest suit. I was always better at speaking than reading. And the longer I've been away, the harder it is for me to read Hebrew. And so whenever a Facebooky friend posts a wall of text in Hebrew and I scroll past it and don't make myself sit and read it, then I can feel guilty about that too.
It is interesting. Just yesterday I was talking with a colleague of mine about the possibility of a class in some way devoted to comics and social media. So one way of approaching that would be, I mean, obviously web comics, right? Because the way that web comics are, I mean, they're basically blogs. But at the same time, I was interested in the ways that social media is represented in a variety of different ways in comics. And this is around the time that I, had been thinking about these essays, preparing for the interview, and that one where you do include quite a bit of information about things that I think it's strangers, that information that you got while on various social media platforms, and I found that interesting.
Yeah, so it's kind of a follow-up of sorts to Ceasefire and Fierces, which are my more journalistic ones, which I do were made about trips to Israel, where I went and interviewed people and tried to get to the bottom of one situation or another. So in the format, it's kind of meant to be with those, but I call it a long distance view of Israel because I did not travel to Israel then. I just read social media and tried to figure out what the heck is going on in Israel and followed people's social media links to articles and stuff. So I did, I wanted to foreground that because of the idea that, if I can't figure out what's going on, then my experience is, I'm definitely not an eyewitness or on the ground. And so my experience is always mediated, as well as just the idea, of the ongoing theme of, am I still Israeli? Am I still a part of Israel? And showing how distant I am, physically and possibly mentally.
So now that you have Toward a Hot Jew, you had mentioned earlier that it's been a while since Jobnik. Is there the next issue? I guess that would be number 10 of Jobnik on the horizon. Is that something that you're working on now?
It would be number 11, and unfortunately, I'm not working on it now. I'm working on, I guess, my next piece that I finished and hasn't been published yet is for a Trina Robbins collection of. So Trina Robbins is she had a Kickstarter and it's coming out through Bedside Press. Mm-hmm. It's a collection of, as far as I understand, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, stories, fiction written by her father in Yiddish that she then translated and adapted into comic scripts and got 10 artists to draw as like 5 or 6 page stories. So that's called A Minyan Yidden, and I believe it's coming out this spring. And so I did a piece for that. I worked from Trina Robbins' script. And the next thing that I'm working on is going to be in another anthology, hopefully. And it's going to be about comics responses to Holocaust. So some of it is going to be more sort of academic-y analysis, but they're also including comics. Mm. And so this is an original semi-fictional comic set during the Holocaust that I'm writing, that it's 18 pages long. So that's what I'm kind of working on now. And through all that, I am also working on my MFA thesis, which is a comic script. So that's been really difficult for me because I'm used to, both in the Jobnik and in the drawn essays, something that feels manageable, like, the Stranging the Welcomer at 44 pages was by far the longest thing I had ever done all in one go. Jobnik is over 200 pages now, but I did it issue by issue. And so trying to write my thesis, it's, going to be a 200, 300 page graphic novel. And I have to sit and write the whole script before I start drawing or before I show it to anyone. So that's been very difficult, and that's taking me a long time. And so I don't really have anything to show for that. Plus I'm too busy to get back to Jobnik at this point. Like, I'm still very into finishing Jobnik, and it's not like I got tired of the story at all. But I just, so many other things got in the way.
I'd actually one more question about the new book. I was curious as how you arrived at choosing of all the essays in the book, Toward a Hot Jew as the title of the book over the other choices of essays you had. What were the decisions that went into that?
That was the publisher. They suggested that we use that. I suggested a few other titles, but I think it's good. Like, when I have them out as zines, that's definitely the title that makes people stop the most. Yeah. And I guess to be pedantic, because the essay will still be in print. So the essay is Towards with an S, and the book is Toward, because they said they thought Toward sounded better. And so it just seemed like the most sort of provocative title that also is a pretty good, suggestion of the themes of the book. Because Towards the Hot Jew, the essay is still in print, I was a little bit hesitant about them using that title and about them using an image from the essay. I was kind of, I wanted an image from the newest essay or a new image. But they know what they're doing, because I think that it is, I was thinking more in terms of people who have read and bought my stuff before, and they were thinking more in terms of people who haven't heard of me yet. So I think they made the right call.
Yeah.
I don't think, by the way, it's pedantic at all to make the distinction between the title of the book and the title of the essay. As someone, I did a book like 10 years ago with toward in the title, or it's towards now. It's towards in the title. And I still have, like, I still look at it and go, oh, should that be toward?
Yeah.
But we went with towards. I don't know what the difference is. And so, so I have, I don't know, towards anxiety, if that's such a thing.
Well, I'm sorry to have triggered you.
No, you didn't at all. It's just, I just kind of understand a publisher making the choice about one version of the word versus the other.
Well, now you got a little support community going on here, right? Between the two of you. It's an exclusive club. The Towards Club. Well, Miriam, we want to thank you for taking the time and talking with us on the Comics Alternative, and we recommend.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, we recommend that our listeners run out and get a copy of Toward, without an S, A Hot Jew, which came out late last year from Fantagraphics.
Yeah, so you can get it off the Fantagraphics website, and it is up on Comixology and Kindle as well, I believe.
Oh, great.
Well, good luck with your work in the master's program and your comics otherwise.
Thank you. I hope I'll see you around at the con circuit.
Yep, thanks.
Thanks.
That was an interesting interview where we were dealing with a creator, but also getting into some of the more kind of academic sides of comic studies and of making comics in the first place. So I like that mix that we got in that interview.
Yeah, I did as well. And it's, one of the reasons that we got into that part of the conversation was because of her own roots in academia now, working on her master's, but also that final essay of the book, which we spent a lot of time discussing, Stranging the Welcomer, really does have a thoughtful, scholarly feel to it. So, I mean, she wasn't just, talking the talk. I mean, she knows what she's talking about here.
Yeah, and I could even see, this book functioning in a variety of different classrooms.
Exactly. Yeah. It's something that, I've been thinking about ways to use this in certain ways in the future. So I'm glad that she agreed to come on the show and talk with us about this.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yeah, it's a great book, Toward a Hot Jew. Also, be sure to check out her website, realgonegirl.com. Some of those comics that she had mentioned during our conversation are still available, so you can get copies of them that way, buy the comics directly from her site, including the first collection, Jobniks, that includes the first 6 issues of that autobiographical series. And it's something you should check out. You should also check out comics at our sponsor's website. And our sponsor for this episode is Discount Comic Book Service, dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. Andy and I do, and you should too. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our conversation with Miriam Libicki. If you go to the website comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Also, you can reach us by email. We are 2guys at comicsalternative.com, and we also and you can also get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And check out our Twitter feed as well, which is at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us elsewhere on social media, such as on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us. Let us know how we're doing and find out what we're doing.
Yes, we do like to hear from you. And until next time, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.